gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
In the name of the living God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sanctifier. Amen.
Amen.
Please be seated, everyone. Yes. I always feel like Advent can't start until John shows up, you know. And he shows up so quietly. There's such little drama to John. I was fortunate enough to be old enough to have lived through the great explosion of popular music in the 1960s, and the full range from sitting on the living room floor and with my grandparents watching the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show to actually being able to go to concerts and see some of the great living acts, some of whom are still alive, some of whom remarkably are still performing, but see them perform and see the great changes that occurred in music, but just how important it was, how powerful, how wild it was, what verve there was to that presentation of music, which seemed to shatter just everything, every convention there was at that point. And the Ed Sullivan Show was kind of the interesting example, because you would see some fellow come out in a suit and sing some pleasant song with a microphone, you know. And that's very nice, okay. And then the Beatles came out, and I think they played music. I just remember the young women in the audience screaming so much you couldn't hear them, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter, because that, energy, verve, wildness. And then something happened. When you can make money off of something, corporations like to assume it or consume it and make it palatable for as many people as possible. And so all that wild, raucous music suddenly was something I was hearing at work in the elevator. And the favorite places we'd go to listen to music, suddenly that music wasn't there anymore. There was something else there. It was called, God help us, disco. Music that had dances with steps and a dress code. What? And everything, the great cone of creativity and everything began to narrow and become, corporate and narrow further. And the range of creativity was squished. And suddenly everything was becoming the opposite of wild. It was becoming processed. It was becoming predictable. It was becoming dull. And then, somewhere along the line, I suspect because of some mild drug overuse, some musician in a ratty club in New York, trust me, I was there, ratty club in New York, who could barely play a guitar, whose bassist is still regarded to this day as the worst bassist ever to be recorded in the history of mankind. I'm sorry, humankind, what have I said? And with 3 chords only, burst open that whole disco-fied corporate world and brought again a wilder wildness to the music. And it exploded yet again. This history of pop musicology, you're probably wondering, what does this have to do? Well, it's all about today's gospel. And the tip-off as to what is being stated in today's gospel is that list of names in the opening verses. It accomplishes 2 things. One, it accomplishes pretty much the exact date when John the Baptist showed up and started to preach, and more importantly, started to baptize. And I will remind you, even though I mention this every year, I'll mention it again. Baptism in those days was used when a Gentile wanted to become a Jew. But the people whom John was baptizing were Jews. He was bringing out Jews to be made into Jews. In other words, to restart, reboot, reappreciate, reaffirm all that was present in Judaism, which they felt they had lost. You can guess what one of those things might have been. There was that wildness that is always there. And the cone of creativity had been compressed. Now, in part, we know that date because the Romans kept very good records. This is the 15th year of the reign of the Emperor Tiberius. That means it's 29 AD. There. But what are these other names there for? I mean, really, Roman records were so good, all that Luke would have had to do was simply put, okay, it's in the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, right? Okay. and everyone would know. But look at the names he puts in there. Who have we got? Well, Pilate, we all know him, right? The more we read of him, the more questionable he becomes, I know. Pilate being the procurator, or viceroy, for a more contemporary term, of Rome in Jerusalem. In other words, he holds all the vicarious authority of the emperor, which means he's a politician, which means he's a very careful politician, which means he's got to make sure he charts that middle course, always, between the largely suppressed and sometimes rather angry Jewish population and the acquiescent group within the Jewish population, and what Rome wants and desires for this entire area of the world. And so it's a real tightrope walk. But that's what Pilate does. He has to aim through the center of that cone. Herod and Philip? Well, Philip, the younger brother, I mean, need I say more? Herod desperately wanted to be treated as an important person by Rome, and made sure of it by making appeals to Rome that enabled him, as long as he was obsequious before the emperor, enabled him to receive certain portions of inheritances granted from one generation to another within his kingdom. In other words, he got a piece of the action whenever there was an exchange, and that was granted by Rome. So he had all the reasons in the world not to be the adamant representative king of Jerusalem, but in fact to be a sort of a, well, toady to the emperor. Philip, again, younger brother, whatever you say, Herod. I wonder if he called him Harry, I don't know. Whatever you say, I'll do it. Annas and Caiaphas. Annas was the chief priest, the high chief priest, the reigning official at the temple. That's a position of considerable power in first century society. His second in command was Caiaphas. Not only was he his second in command, he was also his son-in-law. So they worked together pretty well. And as we know, as we get closer to Easter, we will be reminded, as we know, they sought Rome's favor as well, mostly through Pilate, but nevertheless. These names are given to us not just to date when it was that John the Baptist showed up, but to give us the atmosphere of the times when John the Baptist showed up. This is the most bland of periods in this cultural history. Tiberius did not want to be the emperor. It was supposed to be his older brother. But his older brother suffered a wound on the battlefield when he was 23 years old, and it gradually killed him. And there was another brother, but he was in disgrace. In fact, I think their stepfather had him killed or something. I'd have to look that one up. But anyway, Tiberius winds up being the emperor. And as emperor, well, he was a little indifferent because he didn't live in Rome. He preferred to live on the island of Capri, and who can blame him? But he would have various, acolytes in Rome exercising his authority, and one or two of them got a little big for their Roman britches, as it turned out, and that was a complete mess. But Tiberius, indifferent ruler. Pilate, as we know, navigating the middle course. Herod and Philip, just trying to appease Rome, navigating a middle course, and usually largely ignoring their own people. That's okay. Rome was what was important. Annas and Caiaphas, the same, never in conflict. Father-in-law, son-in-law, that's not going to happen. And then the most curious name of all, and I always love this one. If all the people I'm mentioning sound a little bland to you, well, they are. Lysanias is the most bland. He is the bland who leads the bland. No one has quite been able to figure out how his name wound up in here, because by the time John shows up out of the wilderness in the year 29 AD, Lysanias has been dead for about 40 years. So you can't get any more bland than that, I guess. I don't know. There's a lot of questions about that. It may be that the ruler at the time in 29 AD was so bland, they just named the ruler after someone who was slightly less bland. I don't know. Or maybe this was Lysanias' grandson or something. But still, there's a lot of argument about that still. We don't know why his name is there, but okay. Again, Roman record's so good. We actually know when he died, so we know he wasn't around at this point, but nevertheless, there it is, in there. And in the midst of all this, we've got the empire, we've got the government, in other words, we have the religion, right? The state and religion in agreement with one another and coming to this glorious agreement where they're not going to rock the boat, they're not going to shake things up, and everything's going to be under control. Everything is going to be put on the same rail. Everything is going to be in that rapidly narrowing cone of creativity. And everything will be just perfect then. Unless you're one of those people outside of that cone. Unless maybe you have a question as to why can't we do this in the synagogue? Why does only one person get to mention God's name in the temple, and then only once a year? Why, if we are taught that God is creation and responsible for everything that we see in the city, in the farming country, in the wilderness, why is it our prayers only have validity when they are in one place, at one particular time, and as adjudicated by a particular class of people? Everything has gotten narrow, squashed, bland. Ugh. And then somebody hits those 3 chords, and that out-of-tune historical guitar blows up the amp, probably. And out of the wilderness comes John the Baptist, who reminds us and teaches us yet again that there always has to be, in all religious expression, how it is received and certainly how it is presented, for all of the culture that goes along with it, for as careful as we are about how we comport ourselves within the spiritual expectations of our religion, nevertheless, somewhere in there has to be something that is wild. The wild has to be there, because Christianity is about proclamation, and proclamation requires courage. And courage requires at least a portion of wildness. So John comes. John is typical, of course, because wildness is actually the reaction to constraint. The more you try to squeeze a culture, the more often you see these eruptions of the wild that occur. John's decided, well, he's not going to eat the prescribed diet. He's certainly not going to eat a diet that even closely resembles that of the Pharisees and the chief priests. He's going to eat wild honey and locusts. Fine. Or maybe it's honey and wild locusts, one or the other. He's going to have a wild diet. He is going to live in the wilderness. He is not going to live in the city. He's not going to live in a farmhouse. He's going to live in the wilderness. He's going to live in a place of unpredictability. That's where he's going to be. And when he comes to proclaim his message, he is going to take that which has been rendered safe and comestible, that wonderful practice of baptism that was usually done in a nice sort of vat that was there in the courtyard of the temple in Jerusalem, very polite. The water would be sluiced off from the Jordan, so it would be considered living water. That was one of the stipulations. Had to be living water, but it was in this great vat, and the baptism would take place. And the Gentile would be made Jew. And I don't know, everybody celebrated, I suppose, I would expect. And here he comes and says, why are we doing that when the Jordan River itself is right there? Come to the Jordan River. Do you feel that you are a Jew whose religion does not respond to your desires and your needs and your spiritual questions? Start over again. You don't necessarily need all that. You don't need Caiaphas and Annas. You don't need Herod. What Jew needs Tiberius? You don't need any of that. You just need God, the elements of creation, that holy river outside of the city, and the expression of wanting to be a part of the covenant in as strong and powerful a way as possible. And it's not just John now. It's all of those people are now going to, well, let's face it, get a little wild. The dance doesn't have any steps. The volume is cranked up to 11. Out they go into this place where, away from all the authority and all the constraint and all the expectation, they embrace the wildness. And in so doing, create this whole new body of people who are ready to have a relationship with God that is not determined or edited by a collection of men, well-dressed and well-fed men at the temple, and all those whom they seek to appease. It is suddenly between, well, God, you, and that wild river, as directed by the wild man. And so that wildness is reintroduced to the expression of the covenant in our understanding. Now, the problem with wildness is that it doesn't know constraint, and it, well, can fly about. It can, scald. It can disrupt, sometimes harmfully. It knows few bounds, if any. Wildness in and of itself burns itself out, which is why, if left to his own devices, John would have been rather like a comet who he would streak across the spiritual sky and illuminate certain portions of reality and desire and all of that, and then streak away into the dimness. The wild requires some framing. The wild needs a partner. Or in this case, well, the wild needs a cousin. The cousin brings freedom. And together, that which is wild and that which is free create the new covenant, a shared responsibility. No John the Baptist, no Jesus who is our Redeemer. No wild, well, then no freedom. All of that works together. And this is the first moment. In this era of blandness, suddenly, here is this invitation to know God through an absence of constraint, and in some cases, I guess, restraint. Suddenly, you can dance and you don't have to follow the prescribed steps. Suddenly, there isn't a dress code. There is just you and God and the wild as framed by that which is free. And anyone then can come to God. And anyone can start then on a spiritual path at any age, in any condition, in any reality. If that is what you want to do, it doesn't have to go through a committee. It doesn't have to go through a series of decisions. You don't have to be approved by a collection of men at the temple. You don't have to do any of those things. If that is what you want, then you come and you seek it and you take it. And no one can say, no, I'm sorry, you can't have a relationship with God. No, nobody says that to you, because that's what the wildness is about. And the freedom, well, that's what you get when you participate in this new covenant, entirely based upon the relationship that an individual can build with God, and that individuals together, searching for God, looking for God, yearning for God's love, can create together when they work in community. All of that is now made ready by the coming of John the Baptist. And all we have to do at this point is embrace this wildness that he brings, this disruption, this topsy-turvy appreciation of what is spiritually possible, and then be prepared to greet the wild's cousin who brings the frame that liberates us all and forever. Amen.